by the time I've finished my sort of short intro, hopefully those that are going to have joined will have done so, and we'll get cracking. Hi everybody that's just recently joined. My name is Clive. I'm a member of the PPMA board. I also have a day job working for Somerset Council, managing the organisational development team. Thank you for joining today's session. We've got a really interesting topic, hence why you've all joined. Not really nice topic lined up today, titled "The Future of Work and the Case for Never Retiring." Just before you joined, I've already been made to feel very old, as some of today's presenters weren't actually sure of the individual that's shown on the screen. I can't believe how old I'm feeling. So we've got Tristan and Alexis from Penna, who will be taking over the reins shortly. I'll let them each introduce themselves when they come on the microphone. I've just got a couple of housekeeping bits and pieces to run through before we start. If you've ever joined one of these PPMA webinars, you'll have heard these before, but if not, you're being well behaved by staying on mute at the moment. If you can do so, it just helps with feedback throughout the session. The sessions are recorded, but only the speakers are shown on the recordings, so that's fine. If you've got any questions, do use the meeting chat, and we'll try and get to them at the end. If we don't, and there's a particular juicy questions, we'll endeavour to answer them and get responses to you outside of the session. Conscious of time, particularly with an interesting topic which might generate lots of questions, I'm going to myself go on to mute and hand over to Tristan and Alexis.
Thanks, Clive. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Tristan Moakes. I'm the strategy director at Penna.
And I'm Alexis Curtis-Harris, and I'm the head of equality, diversity and inclusion at Penna.
So to kind of give you some background on the kind of topics we're going to touch on today, we sort of, I suppose, fused together two sort of strands really that we found particularly interesting right now, and what's likely to be interesting in the years to come, and how it affects recruitment. So we're going to look at the future of work. So we're going to look at some really big macro trends that have been sort of taking place over the past few years, but are continuing to take place. And then we're going to zoom in on how some of those are affecting how we might think about retirement, and particularly how we as recruiters and employers will be thinking about employing older workers, essentially. So if we move to the next slide. Just a little bit of background about us. So at Penna, one of the sort of ways we sum up what we do with organisations is we help employers get people excited about working for them. So we have a whole range of specialists and experts at Penna. Myself and Alexis, in particular, work within a team that is focused on employer branding and talent attraction. So essentially, what we do with organisations is look at problematic areas by and large, and help find ways to tap into new audiences, and to essentially promote employer brands. So onto the next slide. Retirement. So yeah, possibly, is retirement overrated? Do we think it's all it's kind of cracked up to be? So we've tried to pick a couple of examples of individuals in the public eye, at least, who've worked well beyond retirement age, and maybe it's a bit easier to do when you have a job that you kind of love, like, you know, being a musician, a rock star, a TV personality, and so forth. But there are plenty of role models for individuals who have had very long careers, essentially, and kind of worked well beyond when most people would normally start taking their pensions. And so if we look at the next slide, one of the sort of things that, you know, certainly from my perspective, has kind of triggered this question in our minds is, you know, a lot of changes that have happened very gradually over many years. So if we kind of think about the origins of, you know, having a pension and retiring, a lot of that has its roots in the early 20th century, where sort of the state kind of felt like, you know, the concept of a pension was needed to come make sure that people didn't sort of effectively live in poverty when they were no longer physically able to work. So it was kind of a necessary safety net. And you can kind of look at the way in which jobs have changed in the past 100 or so years. This is in the UK in particular. And if you go back to around that time when sort of pensions were introduced, there was a lot more, there were a lot more people working in the primary and secondary sectors. So primary sectors being things like agriculture, and secondary sectors sort of being things like manufacturing, as an example. And you can kind of see that the tertiary sector, which is kind of the more service-driven sector, has really come to dominate the sort of the workplace in recent years, but this is obviously a trend that's kind of been going on since the sort of 70s. And what that means is really work is different now, and it's possibly even more different in the past sort of 3 to 4 years for a lot of people than it was in the preceding sort of 20 to 50 years. And I think that's an interesting thing to kind of touch on. So when a lot of people think I must retire, I must sort of call it a day, the reasons why a lot of people might have felt that way have perhaps changed a little bit. So that's one of the things we want to examine. So firstly, I want to look at some broader trends. So if we move on to the next slide, these are the sort of the things that I picked out as particularly relevant right now, and they're all sort of individually having an impact on the world of work and employment, but they're also intersecting with each other. So the sort of each of these trends has a knock-on effect with some of the other trends. So the things I'm going to look at are the accelerating pace of change when it comes to technology and innovation, the aging population. So generally, the fact that we are not only living longer, but the birth rate being sort of on decline means that the balance of population in the UK is swinging much more to the older generations. We're finding workers are more driven by different motivations, and one of those is what we're terming belief and purpose, essentially. We've got a new generation emerging, so that's always interesting. We've talked a lot about Gen Z. That's very much the generation, and by and large, that is driving the coming workforce. But there's also Generation Alpha, and there's a growing platform economy. And I'll come on to kind of talk a bit more about what we mean by that. So starting with, on the next slide, technology change. So there's lots of things out there that are disrupting the labour market from a technology perspective. So you can kind of look to things like Web 3.0, which includes technology like the metaverse and crypto, things like that, essentially, and how that will start to kind of play out to people's kind of leisure time, but also their kind of work life. There's automation, and there's automation through things like manufacturing, but we probably couldn't talk about technology disruption without mentioning AI, and that is something that has been sort of discussed very much in the background for a few years now, but the past 6 months has really been a turning point for what the expectations are for AI on all of our lives, particularly at work. One of the estimates, this is from Goldman Sachs, in terms of the disruption that could be caused by AI, is that up to 300 million jobs could be displaced worldwide. And a lot of work right now, a lot of headlines at least, are sort of focusing on which jobs are most at risk, essentially. What jobs will there be in 10 years' time? And it's really difficult to keep up with all of the speculation that's happening. I think you may have seen in the news articles, I think it was yesterday, BT announcing the plans to kind of reduce tens of thousands of jobs because of their expectation of being able to adopt much more AI, particularly in the customer service space. So that's kind of one of the jobs that they kind of see as being, I probably wouldn't call it under threat, but being made more efficient by AI. And I think when we sort of think about what's the impact, what do we need to do as employers, there are kind of a couple of implications of this. And to explain at last, perhaps the kind of picture that I've chosen here in the background, this is a sort of a typing pool. So essentially, the sort of secretarial pool, the typing pool was a concept or a job rather that was quite widespread up until sort of the 1980s, really. Thousands of people employed in a job essentially to type up documents and reports and meeting notes and what have you. That basically vanished over a series of years as the personal computer entered the workplace and became something that a lot of office-based employees were sort of trained on and became familiar with. The job basically didn't exist anymore. So the point being here is that technology has always destroyed jobs at varying rates, at varying points through history, but our economy and our sort of labor market has always proved very resilient in terms of creating new jobs, new jobs that we haven't seen yet or haven't imagined yet, that will kind of fill that gap essentially. And that's actually quite exciting, because what this enables us to do is unlock more productivity essentially, and more creative opportunities. So as employers, I think what we really need to be prepared for is, firstly, from an AI perspective, really examine how our existing jobs can be improved by AI, essentially using it as a tool to make workers more efficient and allow them to focus on the things that are more productive and more useful. And also to look at how we may need to look at reskilling programs. As the pace of change with technology accelerates, it's going to be really important to make sure that employees are kind of kept up to date with things and given opportunities, not just to learn skills for the job that they're in presently, but be able to transition to new roles as they emerge. The next thing I want to look at on the next slide is the sort of concept of the platform economy. So this is kind of a broadened out term alongside the gig economy. So the gig economy, of course, famously things like Deliveroo and Uber. The platform economy is a little bit broader. So in terms of the definition, it's by some estimates expected to unlock up to $10 trillion of value by 2030. I mean, it's really difficult to sort of know which of these predictions to believe. But what is interesting is that the software that underpins these, the technology such as smartphones and various kind of web platforms, means that it's a lot easier for individuals to effectively earn a living in very different ways to what was possible perhaps a couple of decades ago. So initially, that's people riding bikes and driving cars. But what we're seeing is increasingly some platforms such as Upwork in the US, where more white-collar jobs are able to sell their services through essentially platforms. So, sell their consulting, sell their legal skills or whatever it may be on a sort of like hourly or daily basis and still, earn a very good income. And there's others as well. So, if you kind of think about the creator economy, which is sort of linked to this in many ways, individuals are able to make a living as influencers potentially, or selling things on Etsy and other platforms such as that. So there's a lot more different kinds of career that are out there now. And it's not such a conventional approach whereby you kind of have to find an employer, you have to lock yourself down to a 9-to-5 opportunity. And that's really going to change some expectations for the kind of cohorts that are coming out of university and schools, which is a neat segue onto the next slide, where we'll touch briefly on the upcoming generations. So I mentioned earlier Generation Z. So Gen Z are individuals born around the mid-1990s up to around 2010. So this is the cohort that are kind of just about in the workforce, going through university and in their sort of teenage years at the moment. And there's a lot of research obviously about this generation. What are their values, what are their expectations from a career perspective. And one interesting nugget from this is that by some surveys, 70% of this generation claim to have a second job, which is quite remarkable. And in some cases, this might be a job, i.e. a conventional job working in a sort of retail environment, perhaps on a weekend. But in a lot of cases, what we're sort of seeing is Generation Z from a very young age have the opportunity to make money from some other digital pursuit. So they could be a streamer on Twitch, they could be an influencer on TikTok. There are a lot more avenues for individuals from a very young age, actually, to start earning some actual serious money alongside things that is very much aligned to their hobbies or their passions. And what this means for employers is, CVs for this generation might start looking quite different, rather than sort of that very short section at the end of your CV where you sort of mention your hobbies and interests. We might have CVs that include employment, but a lot more detail on what some of these side passions are, these side hustles actually for Generation Z. And also it's an opportunity once they're in employment to kind of embrace that, to give them space to pursue their whatever their side hustle may be alongside their main job, because whatever the skills that they're able to practice and learn there could be beneficial to employers as well. And on the next slide, what I'll talk about is another thing I mentioned earlier, which is this kind of concept of a belief-driven employee. So again, it's a bit of a gradual shift, but some of the research that's been done by Edelman, where sort of every year they kind of run what they call a trust barometer. One of the things they picked up on the most recent one is a sort of a movement towards workers prioritizing things like purpose and belief and values, those sorts of concepts when they're considering where their next job might be. So one of those kind of stats that supported this was 77% of workers said personal empowerment was essential. So this is perhaps a shift that is in part like a long-term shift, essentially, as society values have changed a little bit, as perhaps people have more options when it comes to employment. They're starting to think about different sorts of priorities. But we may also be seeing a shift that's a result of the pandemic. There's a lot of changes that kind of happened post-pandemic, and a lot of that has forced people to kind of rethink what their priorities are. And one of those might be kind of belief and purpose. So again, another interesting opportunity for employers to sort of consider how much they start to communicate that in recruitment communications, but also looking at retention, to what extent can we make sure that our employees have the right sort of outlet from this perspective? Are they getting that from their job right now? And then moving on to the next slide, the kind of final thing I want to touch on is this aging workforce. So this is obviously kind of the main focus that we're going to talk about next, but ultimately this is driven by a number of factors. The first one being, generally speaking, we're living longer because we're healthier. A lot of workers are working in jobs that are less physically demanding. So by the time they get to retirement age, they're generally in better shape, which is driving things as well. And because of factors I mentioned earlier, such as the reduced birth rate, by 2040, which is still quite a while away, 1 in 7 people in the UK will be over the age of 75. This age group, the over 50s and beyond, is representing an ever bigger share of our population. So it's going to be really important for employers as we kind of get to the sort of the coming decade and beyond that, to really pay attention to this age group from an employment perspective, because there will be talent shortages in the years ahead, and it's going to be important to consider how to keep over 50s in work, and potentially how to attract some of them back to it. So on the next slide, I'm just going to kind of finally talk about some of the more recent data on this topic. It's a real focus for the government at the moment, because they kind of recognize that actually, unless a lot more over 50s can be encouraged to stay in work and come back to work, this country is unlikely to get the productivity gains that are going to be needed in the years ahead for growth. So it's a really big deal in the UK, and particularly for, like I say, for the government. And one of the sort of the trends that's a real indicator of the impact of this is the workforce participation rate. So this is essentially the number of people in that generation, in that cohort, that are taking part in the paid workforce, essentially. And what you can see is there was an increasing participation rate up until the pandemic. So essentially more 50 to 64-year-olds were in some way doing work. And that switched in, you can see it very clearly in March 2020, and started going in the other direction, and it's still going in that direction. So there's been some changes as a result of things like the cost of living crisis has kind of caused some people to unretire, but it's not been enough actually to get us back to where we were in 2019. So this is what we want to really examine, is kind of what's going on there. So onto the next slide to kind of hand over to Alexis.
Thank you, Tristan. So, I mean, as kind of Tristan said, we have an aging population, we have an aging workforce as a result, and people are unretiring or possibly not retiring or returning to the workforce in some way, whether that's by choice or by necessity. But unfortunately, there are still many things that can stop retirees from returning, and many barriers that can be kind of limiting to not just individuals' chances of obtaining new work, but also their confidence in even attempting to return to the workforce. So the next slide, I just wanted to kind of touch on how actually stereotypes really can kill self-belief. And ageism stereotypes do kind of start, unfortunately, at a very young age. Like, think about when we're told how we should dress when we're a kid, or to the hairstyles we might have. And actually, children as young as 4 years old are becoming aware of their culture's age stereotypes. And just to provide a definition, what I mean by stereotypes, in case you're not aware, this is that kind of generalized belief that we might have, or that individuals have, about a particular group of people or category of people. So it's that expectation that we have about a person because they belong to a group. And the thing with stereotypes is very often they're just not true. And biases that we all have, because yes, every single person has bias. Biases can very often be based on stereotypes as well, and that's both for implicit and explicit bias. So implicit being when we don't realize we're doing it, explicit being that kind of more overt and intentional. And so we hear these kind of implicit and explicit stereotypes very often when we're talking about an older workforce. And I'm going to use the word older here, and what I mean is kind of 50 plus, using that kind of terminology for ease today. But we hear stereotypes like, oh, older workers, they don't want career development, they don't want to learn new skills. That's simply not true. Oh, older workers, they don't want to work full time, less motivated, less ambitious. Again, absolutely not true. Older workers, oh, technophobes, can't learn tech, don't want to learn tech. Again, not true. And they're all those things I've mentioned, just a few stereotypes that have just been perpetuated over again through time. But stereotypes also go beyond what we hear, and you can kind of see this image on screen, and I'll explain why this is here, because stereotypes can be ingrained in what we see too. And basically there's an AI system called DALL-E, and it creates images using artificial intelligence based on a written description. So you can kind of see here, we'd searched, please create a picture of an apprentice. Now, I think you can probably all agree with me, what's been pulled up here and what it's basically churned out is quite one-dimensional from a gender and ethnicity perspective as well, but also from an age perspective. They all look, I think we can assume, very young. And why is that so damaging, that things like this will automatically interpret an apprentice with being young? Well, because when we are having a stereotype perpetuated, we begin to self-stereotype, which can lead to kind of those gaps in confidence. It can, as I said earlier, stop us participating, and it can actually even hinder our own performance. And as it says on the screen, hinder or affect our self-belief. I always think there's kind of three types of ageism, should we say. So institutional ageism, where an institution will perpetuate ageism; interpersonal, where the kind of occurs in social interactions in the wider society. But internalized ageism is when a person will internalize ageist beliefs and apply them to themselves because they've heard them. So when stereotypes are prevalent for too long, it's where we see that internalized ageism. And so on the next slide, just kind of looking at, okay, but what does that mean for recruitment? Well, again, unfortunately, might not be true. Might not be, surprising, is that unfortunately, age bias is still very prevalent and is thriving in recruitment, and that is both the explicit and implicit biases. And this can create barriers for those who are of a certain age, who are older. Now, obviously, there's barriers for many other marginalised groups as well, but today, of course, we're focusing on age. And they can present themselves in a number of different ways when we're particularly talking about recruitment, and can be for a number of different reasons. So I'll touch on just a few of them. On the next slide, you can kind of see 2 points here. So the first one being something even which might seem small, but the language that's used. And what I mean by that, as we kind of probably will know from the world around us, language is incredibly important. The language we use can build, can forge relationships, but is equally liable for causing damage or introducing areas of bias or discrimination as well. And when we look at things like job descriptions or adverts, there are often cases where we see language that can, when you dig into it, be deemed as ageist, and can basically insinuate to an external audience that you are looking for a type, and I am going to put that in quotation, a type of person. And if we're looking and kind of, as you say, using language that, for instance, like, we are a lively team, we're looking for a lively individual, we're really dynamic. Now, that's not me saying that somebody who is older cannot be lively, cannot be dynamic, but we're talking about here kind of the general kind of interpretation of phraseology and words. It can give older workers that impression that you're just looking for somebody younger, and that can be a deterrent and can introduce bias at a point before they've even applied for a job. And again, similar in the same vein of that first interaction with somebody, that first kind of consideration point, the experience that we're asking for. So often when myself and my team will review kind of, let's say, job descriptions and adverts, because we've touched on that for clients, so often experience and skill are conflated, but they don't always directly relate to each other. Actually, experience doesn't always equal skill, and skill does not always equal experience. And so when we see kind of these lists of excessive experience that aren't essential, and then you have a list of desirable criteria, again, that are definitely not essential, why are they even there? It can not just discourage a lot of people, but it can really discourage, again, older workers or people who are older, who, again, might have all the best skills, the right skills, but may not feel that their experience is right because of the way it's worded, or the way it's kind of asked for, and the way that kind of, as you say, kind of experience and skill might have been conflated and basically interpreted as one. And then on the next slide as well, again, similarly, in terms of these things that can introduce bias or can, again, be deterrents, are when we're asking for kind of qualifications or the necessary qualifications. Linking back to what I said on the last slide about listing and overlisting things that aren't absolutely necessary or absolutely essential to do a job. How many times have we seen job descriptions where it asks for a degree? Why? How is that going to show a level of skill for a job? Now, there's some jobs, of course, where a degree is essential, but we're talking more generalist here. So consistently listing or overlisting a variety of different qualifications that either might feel out of date to certain people or might be really current and present. I always think when I look at even something like GCSE results and the way that they're kind of identified now by numbers. Now, when I went to school, they were by letters, and I think previous to me, they were not even called GCSEs. So again, like, language and the way we're listing things can give that impression to people that it's not for me, I'm not going to be considered, they're looking for somebody younger. And then just finally, the application process. Now we've kind of narrowed something that is this big into one category here, but again, just looking at how application processes can in some cases feel very tailored to people who are falling within a particular bracket. And That can even be some things such as the way we're asking for applicants, whether it's through CVs, through online applications. Tristan mentioned, like, what is the future going to look like? Are CVs going to be a thing? Are they going to be something completely different? And just kind of thinking about what we're asking for, or what we're asking candidates or applicants to endure and go through as part of an application process, how that can feel and how that could unintentionally be a deterrent and therefore kind of introduce bias into the process. So on the next slide, I just wanted to kind of also, there's a perception that I'm consistently kind of thinking about when we kind of look at our work and our jobs. What do we think is the most important thing? Now, we might all have very different interpretations of this. When I think of what's the most important thing for me when I do my job, it's doing a good job. It's getting good outcomes, it's meeting deadlines, it's producing something that I'm proud of. It's not necessarily the way I did all those things. And so actually, if we start to look into the future, or even look now at the way we scope roles, now this is not even just going to be beneficial for older workers. It can be very beneficial for a variety of people, including those who might have disabilities or long-term health conditions or be neurodivergent, but focusing on the outcomes and the outputs. The reason why we've kind of got this image here is I always think for me, it kind of stems from, or reminds me of, should I say, when I'm at school, when I was at school, should I say, doing my maths, and they're always asking you to show your workings. Now, when I've got the right answer, why do I need to show my workings? Now, I'm not a teacher, and I'm sure there's rationale as to why. But for me, it was always like, why do I need to kind of show that when I've got the right answer? And actually, why can't that translate to the workplace when you get good results? You might not need to work that 9 to 5, that is 5 days a week. If you work around your own schedule and you still get the same outcomes, could workplaces and employers and employees and colleagues adopt that outcomes-based approach in the future as well? And then on the next slide, I just wanted to kind of touch on as well the fact that actually, as with most groups, there is an intersectional disadvantage as well that occurs. And basically intersectionality being that kind of theory of people being multidimensional, the fact that often our struggles are not singular. And very often we hear, yes, about ageism, but also about gendered ageism and racial ageism as well. Because when those two groups intersect, what we actually often see is the largest disadvantage. So nationally, white 50 to 64-year-olds had half the unemployment rate than people from other ethnic groups combined. So half of all of them combined. And actually, if you're a woman and you're from an ethnic minority group and you're over the age of 45, which feels so young, and you're working in a public sector, you're actually amongst one of the UK's most disadvantaged workers. So actually, as we say, like, we're looking at age, but it is compounded even further when we intersect that with ethnicity and gender. So in the kind of final section here, just on the next slide, I wanted to kind of show you, we essentially did some bespoke research before we kind of pulled this together and before we presented this at the previous PPMA, so PPMA conference. So we basically, using the YouGov surveying tool, we surveyed 150 people who are retired between the ages of 50 to 64. Now, we did this to, I guess, back up some of our theories or the research we'd found, but also it did unpick some really interesting points, which I'm going to kind of run through with you. And as you can see here, kind of 23% of people that we surveyed said that they would consider returning to work, which was reassuring because that kind of aligned with what the census was saying as well. So on the next slide, you can see here that we had asked why would people consider returning. Now, as I say, there was many different kind of reasons here, and we tried to not just pull out the because I need more money, because I think money is going to be a something that draws a lot of people into any kind of industry or any role regardless. But of course, with the economic climate at the moment, that is a factor. But there was other things as well, like actually I'm getting bored at home, needing more social interaction again. Actually, I've just got so much more to give. I always think, as someone who is not near retirement age, but I think, okay, I'm going to go through my career, and do I just suddenly one day stop working and that's it? And I've worked my whole life and I stop. What if I have so much more to give? people needing more money, or people just needing a bit more of a purpose, and Tristan touched on kind of purpose earlier as well. And on the next slide, another kind of thing that we asked here as well was about the barriers. So the thing here is that actually there was lots that reaffirmed some of those stereotypes that I mentioned earlier. And I'm not going to read everything on screen here, but I think something that came out quite a lot, and quite a few people had mentioned, was, you can see on the right, we've put dealing with woke attitudes in the workplace. Now, that's a chosen phrase that this individual has used. But I think what came out quite a lot was that maybe dealing with or being in a cultural environment that might be different to what's been experienced before, being in an environment where maybe you do fear saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing or upsetting or offending. And actually a very real barrier for some people. And there was many more than this, but that one certainly did come up quite often. And then on the next slide, we kind of just pulled here just an overview really of, for people, what might make people consider returning. Now, we did look at this aside from money, again, as we said, because I think probably that would have come out top. We kind of anticipated that. So looking again for this particular age group, 150 people between the 50 to 64, what might make people return? You can see the variety of things here. And interestingly, we kind of had a discussion actually yesterday with a different client who had kind of said, actually, if you look at these things here, these could actually be really important for possibly somebody of any age. But I think it's when you kind of start to look at the kind of nuance and the breakdown of these individual points, what that might mean. And that's where this might affect, for instance, older workers. So, for example, I think Tristan had given a really good example of, actually, if you look at the flexibility to determine working hours or how many days you want to be in the office, when we look at maybe kind of Gen Z or even early millennials, there's a desire to be a little bit more in the office, so maybe kind of 3 days. And then you look at maybe older workers or people are above that kind of age group, and there's a desire to be in less. We're talking generalist desires here. So the point that might be important for a lot of people can be very nuanced. And I think that's where this kind of information was really beneficial in us for kind of helping to kind of scope our understanding of kind of what would encourage people back into the workplace. And then just on the next slide, here we've just kind of basically, there we go. I just had to remember what the next slide was. Basically, what kind of job would you look for? And I think I'm not going to dwell on this one because it's quite self-explanatory, but me personally, when I looked at this, I was surprised at how many, 44% of people said that a new job or sector would be something they'd look for. And if you think back to the stereotype I mentioned earlier about older workers don't want to be upskilled or learn new skills, aren't ambitious, this is why it's exactly not true. People are looking for doing something new, learning new skills. Why would they not, just because they're above a certain age? And then the next slide, which I believe is the kind of the roadmap for employers. So after everything we've kind of just touched on here, I think few points that we've kind of pulled out as, I guess, a summary. So it's important, of course, to kind of recognize that ageism in recruitment. As I said earlier, we all have bias. We are human beings, but actually recognizing and consciously looking to be more inclusive can be very important for, as I say, not just encouraging applications, but giving confidence to people as well. That promotion of flexibility that came out strong through our research, but also through existing research that's out there as well. Possibly having that outcomes focused option for jobs moving forward, that might be important as well. And then kind of cultivating confidence, also widening learning programs, these kind of things that we've kind of pulled out and talked about throughout our entire session today. So the final slide, which I think basically, who's ready to retire or not retire? So thank you. That's obviously the end of the session today. I think we have got a few minutes for questions. I believe obviously there is an opportunity if you wanted to send questions on after, but did anybody have any questions in the few minutes that we do have remaining? Oh, sorry, I've just seen someone's made a comment here. I'm 39-year-old apprentice, and due to my belief that apprentices for school leaves, I didn't apply. Well, I'm glad you did, Paul. That's fantastic to hear. And I think there's probably a lot of people in that same situation as yourself. And so, yeah, amazing.
Thank you, Alexis and Tristan. Please do, if you've got any, even though we've overrun slightly there, if you've got any questions, please do pop them in the chat now. We'll get to them. A couple of reflections very quickly from me. I hadn't remembered to mention this at the start. Next week, I'm going to a leaving presentation of a colleague of mine in Somerset Council. 58 years he's worked for the same organisation. Absolutely bonkers. But I'm going to tell him he can't leave now. He can't actually retire. He's been waiting 58 years to do so, and we're going to keep him. Yeah, I did you a huge disservice at the start by saying this was an interesting session. It's so much data and insight and intelligence in that. So thanks to both of you for that. I've had a little look around in advance of the session and found some of those similar stats actually. And the one of them that's a couple of them that stuck out of those second jobs that Gen Z colleagues actually have. Within a year, 25% of those jobs become their primary income, their first job. So it just shows the kind of, I guess, the importance in terms of value that some of those second jobs have. You know, they're not just minor side hustles. In some instances, they become their primary jobs. And something incredibly, again, slightly depressing, down in sleepy Somerset. So much of that resonates. Absolutely. We don't really have a traditional university. We've got the smallest city in England, a net outflow of young people. They're replaced by those folks retiring. The really good news is they're not necessarily getting into paid work, but they are the most active age group in terms of volunteering. So we're working really closely with our communities and to support us as a local authority in terms of that. So that's interesting. The other one is when I do wander in, I work from home, but when I wander into the office, I wander past something called a senior living residence, and it's advertised. It's for 45 pluses. There won't be too many more years and I can move into there. That's absolutely bonkers. We haven't had any questions coming in, but some nice comments saying thank you. So I will extend those thanks and say brilliant. Thank you, colleagues from Penna, for joining and sharing all that information. And thanks to those of you that have joined the session today as well. I've got just one final thing to say, and it's ever so slightly vague, so apologies. But in essence, please do keep an eye out for future sessions. I think we've got the next one that the PPMA are supporting is with Osborne Thomas. We don't have any details just yet on the topic. It could be incredibly interesting. Who knows? Top secret stuff there. But it's due to take place on the 2nd of June. So do keep an eye out and forward the details onto your colleagues that might be interested. I think that wraps us up. So thank you ever so much, everyone, for joining, and hopefully bump into you on another one of these sessions very soon. Thanks, everyone.